Well, session 5 tonight, and if you've done the reading, you know where we're going to be going today. We're going to start venturing into Eden. And of course, as the subtitle says, how creation decisions help us to process evil. For those of you who are familiar with Unseen Realm content, there's going to be some stuff in this lecture I think that'll float your boat. I'm gonna, I'm just going to be honest. We're going to run into something that this is why I could spend the rest of my life academically in Genesis 1 through 11. It's just such fun stuff, but I'll let you know when we get there. Questions tonight that we want to be sure to hit in relation to Eden. What was it? And what was its relation to the rest of creation? How do concepts like the tree of life fit into Israelite cosmology? And how does that concept reinforce what Eden was? On the way, we're going to hit again that the whole will start to sort of leak into what happened in Eden as well, and get into the whole foreknowledge predestination subject. So, like I said, we'll get into what happened in Eden, foreknowledge predestination. How could things go wrong? Let's just start here. There is a description of Eden. Okay, I don't know if it was this class or if it was the Thursday class, but there was a question in the Q&A last time about, I don't know what it was, Eden or the world or something like that. And I made the comment that, hey, all the world wasn't Eden. Eden wasn't the whole world. And I could tell, because that was last week, that was kind of news to some people. So here we are. If that was you guys, well, here we are finally at week 5. But I mean, most of you probably would have, known that if you were familiar with Unseen Realm content, certainly. And one of the bases for this, probably the most obvious, is Eden gets a specific geographical description. I mean, it's one of those things that's easy to read over. You don't often notice it, but there it is. So a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. There it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. Thanks for that little footnote. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth is the Euphrates. So, I mean, you got a number of geographical points to that. That is not the whole world. I mean, what could be more obvious? Yet, there's this assumption that sort of just, flows through evangelicalism, that when we talk about the world God created, we speak of it like we're talking about Eden, like it's this perfect place. And then again, we spill over and we start talking about Eden. Tree of life, like little animals frolicking around, and Adam and Eve. It's like, no, that's just a little piece of the planet. So for some reason, we often just sort of conflate these things, probably just because of tradition. That's just the way stuff gets talked about, and we don't often stop to, think about it. But it's very clear. This is a little spot on the earth. It has specific geography. Another indication of this is Genesis 1:31. Before we even get to the geography, God saw everything he had made. Behold, it was very good. There was evening and the morning, the 6th day. Okay, the text says it was very good. Okay, it doesn't say it was perfect. Now, you don't need to drill down into word study, which I'm going to do in a moment here. All you need to do is think about what Adam and Eve are tasked with. We've had that in chapter 1 before God says, hey, it's very good. I'm looking at it. Good, I like what I've done here. He has tasked the humans with subduing, the earth, stewarding it, ruling it. Again, some of these verbs, these ideas. If it was perfect, you wouldn't need to do that. If it was perfect, like there's no work here left to do, then you'd find some other way to describe it. So that's a little bit of a hint, but if you drill down into the vocabulary, we will find here, let me see which one I have here. Here's Tov. This is why we got the yellow highlights. This is good. We saw this last week, Tov and Ra, good and evil. And in the ESV, it's translated, like you'd expect, good, better, well, best, again, a superlative idea. But over here is a different term, tamim, and this is where you get the notion of something without blemish. Something that we might use a term like perfect. No problem with it. Okay, tamim is not the way this is described in Genesis 1:31. If we turn our little interlinear pane on, we click on very good, it's tov ma'od. Tov, good, ma'od is an adverb, very or extraordinarily. It's not tamim. So again, there are these little things in the text that kind of hint at, well, there's something to do here. It's good, it's really good, but it could be better. Or it needs maintenance, or it needs, it's not, the rest of the world's not like fixer-upper state, but it's not Eden either. Okay, there's a little bit of a difference. The Spirit of God, more, sort of, I don't know, controversial or interesting. We know Genesis 1, at the beginning of Genesis, that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. Tehom is the Hebrew term there. And there's a big, long academic discussion about what does Tehom mean. Now, in the 19th century, late 19th century, after Mesopotamian stuff was translated on into the 20th century, the thinking was that Tehom comes from a Babylonian term, Tiamat. Has anybody ever heard of Tiamat before? Okay, a couple of you. Tiamat is the name of the chaos dragon in Babylonian cosmology. Shortcut to the story. In the Babylonian story, how do we get creation? Well, according to the story about Tiamat, which is the hero of that story is Marduk. It's 6th century BC, so it's later than some of the other Babylonian creation stories. Marduk has to battle the dragon, this sea dragon, Tiamat. And she is a formidable foe. She is sort of a forerunner to Leviathan, which we'll get back to in a moment. This great sea beast. Okay, so why would they be talking about these things? Again, think of the metaphor. Okay, these are all metaphors. The sea was a place that was to be feared because you couldn't live in it. Okay, it could kill you really easily. If you're out in the water, humans don't really do so well on the water. We need ground and houses. We don't live in water. We're not like aqua people, all right? So there's just a threat even when the sea is behaving. You can't live there. When it's violent and capricious, then you're in big trouble. And there are things that live in the sea that aren't like things you're used to seeing. They're just like other things. They're like space aliens or something like we would think of. These creatures that just sort of don't fit in our world. That's because they're in this other world. And so, it was very normal for people in the ancient world to conceive of these large, grotesque, man-eating, ship-destroying, kinds of creatures. And they became emblematic for everything that the sea threatens us with. Tiamat was one of these. So Marduk has to battle the chaos waters, the great beast, Tiamat. And he wins, of course, because the story's about him. Of course he wins. He splits her body into heaven and earth and then brings order out of chaos. And this is where we get creation, the Babylonian story. That's the real short version. And so some people looked at Tehom and thought Tiamat, Tehom, they kind of sound alike, and like maybe this is sort of a cryptic way of referring to God battling, the sea beast. Maybe Genesis, comes from Babylonian stuff and it's sort of hidden away here. Again, this is what you'll read on the internet a lot, and it was very popular in academic circles, late 19th century, early 20th century, on into the mid 20th century. What changed? Well, what changed was the Ugaritic texts were discovered, different set of cuneiform tablets, language, and they actually have a word that's closer in relation when it comes to the sea, okay, the unformed, the unpredictable sea. And that's actually a better fit. And they actually had their own version of the sea beast, and that was Litanu, which, if you spelled it in Canaanite, would be Leviathan. And we actually have that word in the biblical story in passages that are about creation. Let me go to one quickly here. Psalm 74. Let's take a stab at the verses here. There we go. My God and my King is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea. By your might, you broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan was thought to be a beast that had lots of different heads. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Well, that's odd, because we go from sort of creation and water, sea language to the desert wilderness. You dried up ever-flowing streams, so on and so forth. You get down here, yours is the day, yours is the night. You've established the heavenly lights and the sun. You fixed the boundaries of the earth. This is Genesis 1 language again. So without going, into Psalm 74, there were those who thought that this is what's going on. Now, I'm rabbit trailing into this because if we go back to Genesis 1, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the deep, the surface of the deep. So we need the Spirit of God to restrain whatever this chaos is. We don't get that language, the Spirit of God hovering over. And, there's other passages where that verb is used of sort of caretaking, the eagle or the bird, with its young hovering over the nest and making sure everything's okay. We don't get any sorts of those descriptions, that are, like that of Eden. We do get it of sort of the wider creation. And so some, would look at this and say, okay, God has to do something here, because if God, wasn't still active in the thing he's made, the whole thing would just unravel and come apart. Now, we're more familiar with this idea from the New Testament, where we have language like of Jesus, the co-creator. He creates all things visible and invisible. And we have this language, by him all things hold together and subsist and whatnot. So this kind of thinking you'll find it in the New Testament, you'll find it in the Old Testament, but you really don't see this kind of language when it comes to Eden. Eden and the world around Eden are not the same thing. Okay, that's the only point we want to make with this, at least at this time. So you have this sense where there's something different. What else is there about Eden that often gets overlooked? Eden is, in Ezekiel, a garden. Well, there's no surprise. We get that in Genesis. Down in verse 14, okay, we have the description of the holy mountain. So how in the world can Eden be a garden and a mountain? Like what's that? And of course, we can sort of conceive if we want to literalize things. Well, there's probably this mountain there, and it had a garden somewhere on it, because mountains have gardens periodically. What's wrong with that? And it doesn't bother us that if we go back to Genesis, we don't get the mountain there, but that's okay. We get it somewhere else. We try to literalize and put these things in our mind because we're not thinking of the metaphor, because the metaphor is not clear to us. To an ancient person, it's very normal to think that the gods, and this was the reading you did for tonight, that the gods, or God in the case of Israelite thinking, biblical thinking, it's very normal to conceive of deities living in gardens and mountains, because this is where you see them all over the place, just across the board. Why? Because if you're living in the ancient Near East or Canaan or whatever, where not everybody gets to live in a garden, or not everybody gets to live in a place where they have enough to eat. You are living in a subsistence economy. Every day, your big concern when you get up in the morning is, will I have enough to eat? Will I have enough water? Will my cattle, my livestock, if I'm lucky enough to own them, will they be able to say the same thing at the end of the day? And then the next day comes and it just repeats. Okay, this is why civilizations formed around rivers, because there's water there. Water grows, helps things grow. It helps keep animals alive, helps keep humans alive. Not everybody, could do that. So the idea was that, we can scratch out a living here, and boy, we're blessed if we live near a good water supply and it doesn't dry up, because then we're in a world of hurt. But the gods never have to worry about this, because they live in paradise. They live where there's always enough water, and more than enough. It's just gushing everywhere. It's well watered. There's a mist that covered the ground, sprayed the ground, kind of like in the grocery store. You go up to the to the produce, and there's that little mist there. That's what I think of anyway whenever I see that thing. But it's like they never have to worry about want. They're always going to have enough to eat. They're always going to have this paradise. And they live on mountains as well, because they're remote. The gods don't really like to mingle with people. They're special. They don't like to, mingle with the unwashed masses and all that kind of stuff. So there was this sense that because of remoteness and paradise, this is where the gods live. And so these became metaphors to describe sacred space. Now, how do you transmit that when you are building structures and temples because you want the gods? Good grief, you spent all week making this idol and you want the god to show up and like it. So you want it to look like home, to remind the deity of home. So what do? You decorate it like a garden. You might put it on or near water. Or you might build an artificial mountain, like a pyramid or a ziggurat. Okay? That's what's going on up here. You're mimicking the homes of the gods. This is ubiquitous in the ancient world. Okay? I'm sorry, it's not just because ancient aliens like triangles, okay? It really isn't. There's something more going on here upstairs. You're making a nice place to live for the deity that you hope will come here and favor you. That's why you're doing it. So these are common metaphors that are part of the Israelite, world too. Now, what goes on in sacred space to an Israelite is a whole lot different than what goes on for an Egyptian and a Mesopotamian and a Canaanite or a Syrian. Okay, but the trappings, the condo, as it were, okay, is going to look a lot the same. It communicates the same idea. It would be really dumb of the biblical writer to sit there at his desk one day and think, I want to describe where Yahweh lives, but I'm going to do it in such a different way that nobody who reads this is going to be able to pick up on it. Why would you do that? You want people to pick up on it because once they're drawn into the scene and they know what you're talking about, then you're going to hit them between the eyes with theology. They're going to be a captive audience. They're going to know what you're trying to communicate and how it's different from what they are thinking. That's the whole point. You use sameness to get them to the place where they can entertain difference in terms of content, your theology. So we get this in different passages. That's an obvious one. I want to click out to LBD. I think this was on your reading. I can't remember. I mean, I wrote, it was? Sweet. Okay. There's a lot of good stuff in this really short article. And I like it because it's condensed. Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Because of, again, that kind of language, the temple was often understood as a microcosm of creation. Walton, if you've read John Walton, his book on Genesis is big on this. This is pretty much where he tracks the whole time. How is the temple like, the cosmos? How is Eden like a temple? Okay, to connect these things together. The identification of the Garden of Eden as the first temple can be seen in its physical description. I mean, again, all this stuff's easy to read over. But you've got Tigris and Euphrates. Again, they were, to a Mesopotamian, the Tigris and Euphrates were significant in terms of temple talk and what goes on at temple rituals. And so here they are in the biblical narrative about Yahweh, or the God of Israel. Okay? They would have picked up on this. Gold and onyx, mentioned in Genesis 2:11 and 12, are used extensively to decorate the sanctuaries and priestly garments in the Torah. Again, if you're reading the Torah closely, you can't miss that. Why is the garden described like the Torah, like the tabernacle? Why is the tabernacle described like the? Oh, I get it. I mean, they're supposed to make these connections. They're intentional. They're deliberate. The connection is also seen through the activities that take place. And the article goes through some verbs. These are verbs, again, used of priestly service. They're used of God's mobility, in the temple, in sacred spaces. Then you have the cherubim imagery. Again, that one's kind of obvious for us. Walton suggests the menorah might be the tree of life. There's some doubt on that. If you listen to the podcast, we did an episode on the menorah. So there's still some split thought there. Temple was understood to function principally as a place of rest for the deity. Well, what else is the deity supposed to do after a hard day of doing deity stuff? He goes home. Okay? I mean, you have to think, you have to carry the metaphor through mentally as to what they're thinking and what they're describing, what these places mean. They're houses. They're palaces. This is what they're for. And Eden described as a mountain. And he goes into some Canaanite stuff again. And Walton's thought that, Eden doesn't like give us a grocery list and say, okay, here's the grocery list and here's why the grocery list exists. Walton's point is that these things were just pretty self-evident to an ancient person. And our problem is they're not. So we have to spend some time thinking about them as to why they are what they are. I'm not going to click out to Beale. It's more of the same. A few other verses that are interesting. This is Isaiah 51:3. For the Lord comforts Zion. He comforts all her waste places and makes her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. Well, Zion was the mountain of God. Okay, Zion is where the temple was. And in Isaiah 51, the vision is recovering that because of the impending doom of the exile and all that stuff. Ezekiel 20:40. For on my holy mountain, the mountain height of Israel, declares the Lord God, there all the house of Israel, all of them shall serve me in the land. There I will accept them. There I will require your contributions and choicest of your gifts and your sacred offerings. It sounds like, you would give gifts and offerings, you'd bring them to the temple, right? Okay. Well, here it's on a mountain, Mount Zion. The temple's decorated like a garden. It's got the cherubim, it's got the lions, it's got the pomegranate decorations, it's got the garden imagery on the poles. Again, this is deliberate. It's supposed to make you think of the primeval house of God, the abode of God, which was Eden. That's why the tabernacle is decorated the way it is. And we'll hit these things as we go through the class, more specifically. But just to orient you mentally here. Think of Eden. The point is not that Eden wasn't a real place. I mean, I think there had to be a place. It's given geography on the earth. Now, it's true, as we're going to see in a moment, that the geography transcends, it does not eliminate, it transcends a literal sense. Okay, remember when we talked about metaphor? Metaphors, can mean more than the typical one-to-one literal thing, plain sense that pops into your head. It can mean more, but it's not going to mean less. This is a good example here with Eden. Eden gets specific geography, and the geography is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be unexpected, to us anyway. So if Zion is the Temple Mount, and right there in the middle of Israel itself, if that's described as God's past, present, future garden mountain, again, another way of saying it, if these links are created between Eden, and again, we'll get to tabernacle, temple, but Eden is a garden and a mountain, Zion is a garden and a mountain. If these things are intentional to describe the abode of Yahweh, the sacred space of Yahweh, we ought to think about this terminology not just as a place we wished we could go visit, like archaeologically or something. Like, I want to find where Eden was. Okay, some people are kind of obsessed with that. Okay, there's a lot worse ways to spend a day or a lifetime. But to really get the most out of it, you have to start thinking more abstractly. What are the concepts, the metaphors that extend from this word? How am I supposed to think about Eden? In other words, I can think about Eden as a place that, had latitude and longitude. But if your thinking stops there, you're going to be missing a lot. So there's the recognition of Eden, but then there's how to think about the place. Not just where the place was, but how to think about the place, what it meant. The stuff that's packed into the terminology. Here's one. If all that's we're supposed to think about, a place and then concepts. What do we do with this one? Ezekiel 38:12. This is part of the Gog and Magog thing. I'll start in verse 10. Thus says the Lord God, on that day thoughts will come into your mind. You will devise an evil scheme. Again, this is Israel's enemies. And say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates, to seize, spoil, and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited. And the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth. Please don't think of Jules Verne here. Okay. Please don't think of the hollow earth. Please, I'm begging you. But what do we do with this description? You read through Ezekiel 38. This is, again, some sort of invasion, whenever, of Israel, of the Holy Land, where God's people live. And it's described as being at the center of the earth. Well, if you go to Google Earth tonight and you just put in, you just take a look at the globe, you're going to realize that that's not the case. It's not literally the center of the earth. So, what's going on here? And my hint is, let the Bible be what it is. Cosmology, again, does not conform to literal expectations, but it's going to communicate really important, and I would say pretty cool ideas. So I used this illustration, and it's the best one I could find. And look, for those of you who are into like comparative mythology, yes, I know this comes from the Norse gods, okay? I know that. But I like it. It's the best one I could find. This is a picture of the world tree. This was an idea, again, that is present in lots of ancient cultures. Remember the three-tiered cosmology we talked about in weeks past, where we've got the earth, and then there's the firmament, there's waters above the earth, below the earth emerges from the waters and all this stuff, and then there's below the earth, okay, this kind of language, three-tiered cosmos, don't make images of anything on the earth or that is above the earth or under the earth. You get it in Exodus 20, which is the Ten Commandments. You get it in the New Testament, Philippians 2. In case I'm doing a really terrible job, quoting it, let's go to Philippians 2:10, just so that you get the flavor of it. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Okay, it's a three-tiered reality system, three-tiered cosmology. This is what I'm talking about. Now, in the ancient world, this is the conception they had. You had the world above. Again, and this is another place that the gods live because people don't. They're not earthly. Supernatural beings are not earthly. So this isn't where they belong. Okay? They can come here, but it's not really where they belong. So we've got the world up there, we've got the world we experience, and then we've got the world where we go when we die. The underworld. Sheol. Again, these concepts, the words actually mean something, underworld. It actually reflects, again, the cosmology. The idea was that these three things are connected by a polar axis, which the ancients called a world tree. Their conception was, again, that there's this huge axis that goes all the way through all three and connects everything. It connects everything. It holds the cosmology together. It's the chief pillar under the earth, or the chief pillar of the sky, again, to borrow a little biblical language. Now, what might you think of the place that was right in the middle? Would that be an important place? Because that's the place where heaven and earth meet. And that's the place where, if we want access to the dead to hopefully make them alive, that's where that would happen. Jerusalem in biblical theology is the center of the earth. It is the place where the entire cosmos connects and is maintained, specifically Jerusalem. This is why there's a temple there. This is why it's a garden. This is why it's a mountain. It was God's dwelling. He holds all things together. Now, for a Mesopotamian, it was Marduk. Okay, for an Egyptian, it was somebody, and these change. In polytheistic systems, this changes depending on the popularity of a certain deity at a certain time. Well, we had a drought for the last 100 years. That deity stinks. We need a better one. So again, somebody else will take the top position. And they were okay with that. Polytheistic systems are okay with that kind of thinking. They just adapt. So we've got Ezekiel 38:12. Another example, Ezekiel 5:5. Thus says the Lord, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations. Ooh, now we get the nations in the picture, with countries all around her. And unfortunately, she has rebelled against my rules. If anybody should be walking with me, and if there should be harmony at any place, it should be this one. And it ain't there. Even this place is corrupt. The tree above the ground, Well, if we're in primeval texts, that's the tree of life. Where else would there be life? It's where God is. God is the source of life. You know, there are texts in Judaism that talk about the tree of life sealing up or being over, shutting off the realm of the dead. Again, when you read something like that, if all you can think about is, oh, I wonder what that looked like if I went up and scraped a little bark off of it. Look, that isn't the point. The point is the ideas that the God of Israel is the source of life. He holds the keys to life and death. He creates and he destroys. Okay, nobody else does that because he lives here. This is where his house is, the tree of life, all this stuff. And again, when you get the tabernacle and you get the temple, this is why the imagery of this central place is preserved. It's also why later in eschatology, it's brought back. And isn't it curious? Isn't it curious to go down to the Messiah line there? It's not an accident that the Messiah is described as a tree or a branch. Interesting enough, he's crucified on a tree. Okay, the concepts mean something. Let me just click out here. This is why I said I could spend my whole life in Genesis 1 through 11. The rivers of paradise. Now I'm just clicking out. This is a source I didn't assign, but it's an Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. So the guy's discussing the rivers, Garden of Eden, Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, Parat. These are the Hebrew terms that go there. Tigris, Euphrates, and a couple others. And just a few lines from this. Josephus provides the only reasonable, coherent, post-biblical Jewish account of the rivers, the 4 rivers in paradise. He identifies the Pishon as the Ganges, the land of Havilah, as India. The Gihon is the Nile, presumably because of the land of Cush, goes through the land of Cush, through which it flows. It's taken its normal biblical sense of Ethiopia. 2 rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, again, those were easy. Josephus seems to imply that all 4 of these rivers originate in the waters of the ocean, again, the main water source. Remember, the seas were gathered into one place, which he describes as the one river which encircles the whole earth. Remember, the seas are gathered to one place and the earth is in the midst there. That this one river, ocean, originates in the Garden of Eden, which he probably located in the extreme east of the world. Other early Jewish texts also identify the Gihon as the Nile, and he goes on and on. So here's one way you could draw it. This isn't the cool one, though. When you bring in the nations, it gets real interesting. The table of nations in Genesis 10 gives us the most comprehensive biblical account of the inhabited world. So you all know what the table of nations is. I'm going to skip all this chronology stuff. And he comes down here to a Second Temple Jewish book called Jubilees. It's an intertestamental book. And the writer of this did a lot of thinking about the table of nations and the center of the world. The table of nations formed the basic world map of the Jews in the biblical and post-biblical periods. It was constantly reinterpreted to fit the changing state of their geographical knowledge. Again, so they would adapt as they learned more things. If we exclude its simple reuse in 1 Chronicles 1, the earliest and most significant interpretation of Genesis 10 is Jubilees 8 through 10. So this is a very old interpretation, almost back into the biblical period, the period of the chronicler. I'll cut to the chase here. The boundaries between the territories, if you look at the 70 nations, the boundaries between the territories of the 3 sons correspond precisely to the boundaries between the 3 continents according to one school of Ionian, that is Greek geography. And he's writing in the intertestamental period. This is the Hellenistic period, a century or 2 after the biblical period, right on the edge. Here's what you get if you put it into a map. You notice what's at the center? Zion. This is how whoever wrote Genesis 10 would draw the map of the world. Now, that doesn't conform to literal geography, but it sure says a whole lot. Again, the goal is always communicating ideas. It's a battle for ideas. It's a battle for the hearts and minds of people. It's Yahweh against the gods. It's Israel against the nations. It's cosmic geography. It's theological geography. It escapes us because we don't live in this world. We have no concept of any of that. To an ancient reader or writer, they know instantly what you're claiming. They know the intellectual and theological battle you want to have, or that the writer is engaging you in. There's stuff like this, just all over the place. Object lesson in reversal. This is Daniel 4. Why does Nebuchadnezzar have a dream that he's a tree chopped down and destroyed? Nebuchadnezzar's god was Marduk. It's the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I'm sorry, Nebuchadnezzar, but the Most High says that Babylon is not the center of the world. Yes, we're here in captivity, but you're toast. Hope you like grass. Again, the imagery means something. It's you know what it is? It's a good poke in the eye. It's there you go. That's what it is. You are the top dog here, the king of kings, famous, Babylon and all this kind of stuff. Well, not so much. Your time is short, and to show you that you should have given the God of Israel, remember the God of Israel, those bunch of Hebrews that you captured a while back and brought over here. Remember the God of Israel? You should have given glory to the God of Israel for the kingdom that you have, but because you don't, you're going to go insane for a while. I'm just here to tell you, your kingdom is going to get cut down and taken from you. And the imagery that's used, again, is this tree stuff. I mean, what's up with trees in the Old Testament? You can get this in Faith Life Study Bible. I can't remember if I had you read this or not. There's lots of interesting stuff that happens at trees in the Old Testament. Genesis 12:6. Yahweh appears to Abraham at the oak at Shechem. Okay? Other things happen at the oak of Shechem. Joshua erects a stone with the law at the oak of Shechem. Okay? Oak of Shechem became a mikdash, a sanctuary. Why would they make this place where the oak tree at Shechem? Why is that? Why would anybody think of building a sanctuary there? It's because this was the place of divine encounter. God has an unusual habit in Genesis of showing up at oases and trees. Why might that be? Because you're supposed to think of Eden, the lush garden, the paradise. They eventually put a pillar at Shechem. There's the palm tree at Deborah. Why is Deborah sitting under a palm tree? Because God meets with her there. That's where she gets information from God because she's a prophet. Again, you just go on and on. Eventually this gets perverted. Everybody starts building trees or building sanctuaries at trees to create rival places of worship to the ones that Yahweh owned. This is why the prophets eventually say, you people are just, you worship some deity at every green tree. It's creating places of distraction. You don't need to go to that tree at Shechem. I got one right here. It's a good tree. You'll like it. Well, who's the God there? It doesn't matter. It's a nice place. You'll feel right at home. Again, they're trying to convince people of divine encounter. This is theological rivalry with something as really to us weird as trees. A couple other things. So Adam and Eve, we'll spend a few minutes on this because we're going to get into it a little bit later next week. But we know what happens with Adam and Eve. Again, we know the story. I'm not going to rehearse, the story itself. But in your reading for tonight, I get into, a little bit about kind of the implications here and about God's foreknowledge. If the fall was predestinated, doesn't that make God the cause of evil? Adam and Eve hadn't sinned prior to the incident in the garden, but they were not perfect. Only God is perfect. Okay? Adam and Eve were not God. They were imagers of God. They were innocent. God had shared his attributes with them, one of which is freedom. And again, from the content of the book, like I said, I know we'll get into it when we get into supernatural rebellions. But it's a really significant thought that when God decides to share his attribute of freedom with beings, in this world, humans, and in the supernatural world, when God makes that decision, he has decided that he is not going to either make robots or turn them into robots. They have the capacity for failure. They have the capacity for rebellion. God knows this. He's not surprised when it happens. This is the basis of what theologians and philosophical theologians will call the free will defense, the free will theodicy, the explanation for evil. It's a view that derives from and arises from the text because of imaging. This is what I want you to see. You cannot rightly be called an imager of God if you do not have this attribute, because God is not without that attribute. God is not a robot. It's cheating theologically to say, well, God shared all his other attributes like intelligence and creativity and emotions, but he didn't share this one. We don't have free will. But the other ones, yeah, Well, you cheat. On what basis are you going to withhold this one and accept all the other ones? Because that's what some creedal statement says in the 16th century. Well, good for you. Okay, on what biblical basis are you going to withhold that? Are you going to say all the other ones count except for this one? Because if that one gets on the table, then we have an explanation for evil that doesn't involve God forcing sin, predestinating sin, or even needing sin. It is what it is because lesser beings who are able to choose chose wrongly. And I know, that's not comforting on one level because, well, why doesn't God step in there and stop everything? Well, he could, but you have to eliminate everybody, and that would be like admitting it's a bad idea. Well, nobody's going to be around to criticize God. Why doesn't he just wipe us? Yeah, well, sure. That's what you're reduced to. The elimination of all intelligent beings, everything that's made in God's image. Yeah, God can end evil real quickly. But the fact that he didn't do that ought to be a sufficient answer for you. He has something else in mind despite the pain of failure, the pain of evil. Now, I want to get to this one. We can talk about the temptation, and we will a little bit later. I want to get to this summary note, and then I want to share a resource with you. This is from a guy named Terence Fretheim. I believe this is the Fretheim quote. And I don't agree with him theologically on certain things, but I like the way he puts this. The continued use of image of God language in the narrative. Remember, image of God, it doesn't go away after the fall. Chapter 5, chapter 9 is notable in that Adam is not presented as a slob or Eve as a foul wretch. I kind of like the way he put that. They're still imagers, is his point. They're not lesser in status. God sending them out of Eden to take up the same task given in 2:15, and he repeats it in 3:23, recognizes that humanity has not been reduced to a state of total depravity. Like, there's just nothing good in you anymore. Why do you even exist? I'm just going to turn my back on you and we're done. Adam and Eve leave the garden with a certain integrity. They're still imagers, still the bearers of the divine purposes for the world. Moreover, that the flood story does not immediately follow is important. The situation is not yet what it will be in chapter 6. It's going to get worse. Rather, the creator of the universe takes on human form, goes for a walk among the creatures. That's Genesis 3:8, by the way. And personally engages them. This is no naive theology. God comes to the man and the woman in their sin. God does not leave them or walk elsewhere. I think that's really well said. The allusion is to Genesis 3:8, which is kind of interesting in light of our subject for tonight. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. If we look at the word walking, I think I actually ran this search. Is that it? No, let me run it here because it's kind of interesting. Here's the same verb in the same form. Look at where else it shows up, God walking. Deuteronomy 23, the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. What's the scene? It's the tabernacle. It's the camp of Israel on the way to Canaan. 2 Samuel 7:6, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. You know, there's only 8 of these in the whole Hebrew Bible. And 2 of them, I don't know if I did a quick read through here. There's one about the king, which is interesting. But 2 of them are tabernacle temple, and then there's one in Eden. It's just another way to connect the 3 things. It's a rare term in a rare form. But if you go back again to Fretheim's observation, again, God doesn't just take off. He's still there. He's still there. There was my search right there, just duplicated. I want to show you something. In the unseen realm, I talk about this in relation to 1 Samuel 23. And again, I'm not going to repeat the whole thing because you were to have read that for tonight. But if you read 1 Samuel 23, if you didn't get to the reading for this week, go back and read it. But in that story of David and Keilah, God foreknows 2 things that never come to pass. Okay, it's the story of David. He's holed up in this city. He's trapped. Saul finds out about it. Saul's I'm going to go down there and surround the city, and I finally have him. Finally going to get him. So David, here's when that Saul knows that he's in this walled city, and he knows what it means. He's in trouble. So he says, hey, bring the ephod over here. I got a question for God. Actually, I have 2. Will Saul come down and surround the city? Will he lay siege to the city? And God says, yep. And then he asks, will the men of Keilah, whom David has just saved their booties from the Philistines, will they hand me over to Saul? God says, you betcha. So what does David do? He does what we would all do. He leaves. He's not a moron. He leaves. And Saul, hears that he's not there anymore, and he turns around. He never gets down to the city. He never surrounds it. David gets away. But God foreknew two things that did not come to pass. Therefore, foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination, does it? God can foreknow things like what's going to happen in Eden. He makes his decision to create supernatural imagers, human imagers. He wants them in his house. That's why we're all here in Eden. That's why we're here. But he knows they're going to fail. This is why other passages say that from before the foundation of the world, God had a salvation plan. Now, it's going to be costly. The whole thing is costly. The whole thing opens the door for evil and sin and suffering. But for some reason, God deems that a better world than a world without us. It's as simple as that. God doesn't create humanity as his imagers and then watch what's going on in the gardens. Oh, I should have thought of that. Oh, that was stupid. No. Should have anticipated that. How did I not see that coming? He did. Now, for those of you who are into this topic, I'm going to recommend a book, but I'm going to throw in a caveat here. This is, to date, the best defense of the free will theodicy. Theodicy is the problem of God and evil. The author is John Peckham. I have met John. He quotes me in this book, but that's not why you should get it. He's a good guy, and this is a terrific book. Okay, John is an Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist. So he and I are not going to agree theologically on some things, but if you're into apologetics, okay, this kind of stuff, this is a must read. This is a book you must read. And I'll be honest with you, it's not light reading. If you've ever read a philosopher write something, it's not light reading, but it's good. And it's not aimed at scholars. He's trying, to communicate this to, again, pastors and the general public. But it is the best thing out there right now. So much so that he quotes atheists in the book saying that basically he's solved the problem of theodicy in most respects. But then he's very honest. He goes off and he talks about how his work gets picked at, and then he responds to it, the whole idea. But this is a whole lot better, and he interacts with evangelicals who, I'm not going to drop any names here, who do believe that God ordains and predestinates everything, every act of evil that you can possibly imagine. And so he's taken that on too. He's not just taking on the atheist, confronting Christians with how can God be good and omniscient and allow evil. He's taken that on, but he's also taking on the other side, other views within the believing community. So if you're into that topic, I highly recommend it. Let's pray.